Good afternoon, everyone. We're just going to give it a couple more minutes to let some people file into the webinar. So thanks for joining us today. We'll get started in just a couple minutes. We're going to get started in just a couple minutes. We still have some people coming into the Zoom room. If you want to jump into the chat and tell us where you're from and where you're enjoying this webinar from today, we'd love to get that happening. We'll get started here in just a second. Okay, I think we're going to go on and get started. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm excited that you all have taken some time out of your day in order to join us, whether that is your morning coffee from the West Coast, your lunchtime lunch and learn in the Central and Eastern time zones, or no matter where you're joining from today. We appreciate it. Go on and drop that into the chat where you're joining from today. My name is Trent Gilbert. I'm the Vice President of Student Search Solutions here at Carnegie, and we are really excited about this webinar today. From discovery to distinction, connecting recruitment and student success for a lifelong impact. Before we get started, just a couple of real quick housekeeping items for you as it relates to this webinar. We've planned this to be about a 45-minute discussion with about 15 minutes of Q&A at the end. So in order to actually ask that Q&A, we'd like for you to use the Q&A function via Zoom in the control panel it's Zoom. It's either the top or the bottom of your screen, but use the Zoom Q&A feature. Our team is there answering questions in real time, as well as we'll save some to answer near the end of our conversation today. As well, feel free to join in on the chat. If there's something that sounds intriguing, you want to connect with someone, we'd love to have that conversation going on there. Closed captioning for this webinar is enabled. For those who want captions, you can turn them on and off via your personal Zoom settings. At the end of this session, we will, a couple hours afterward, when the file processes, we will send you a recording of this webinar. So this webinar will be recorded and you'll get a copy of that. And we'd love for you to go on and complete the post-webinar survey that you'll receive at the end of it. So without further ado, there's housekeeping to get anything started. I am excited to be joining you today. Again, my name is Trent Gilbert. I'm the Vice President of Student Search Solutions here at Carnegie. Prior to joining Carnegie, I spent about 15 years as Vice President for Enrollment Management at a couple different institutions. So to this conversation, I'm bringing a little bit of the enrollment perspective and that position of Vice President for Enrollment on campuses. I'm joined by two of my phenomenal colleagues, and I'm really excited about our conversation we have today. So I will let them introduce themselves. Jaretta?
Thanks, Trent. Hi, everyone. I'm Jaretta Nelson, and while I'm 6 months a part of the family of Carnegie and delighted to be here, I have about 4 decades in higher education and about 20 years or so, close to it, at Credo, where I have served as what I like to call a student success evangelist. I got my start in as a music faculty member. So for those of you on the call with us today who are coming from that academic side of the house or curious about partnering in this topic with academics and that side of the house, I have a special bent in that regard. But I also really, truly have been engaged in that recruit all the way to distinction as an administrator. So my part of the conversation today is to show what partnership can really do to help that journey, and particularly thinking about student success all the way from the start of our connection to students through their graduation and their give back to get today. So I'm thrilled to be a part of the conversation and to be joined by these two colleagues, including Mike Keene. Mike?
Thank you, Jaretta. Hi, everyone. Wonderful to be with you today. My name is Mike Keene. I am Carnegie's Senior Vice President for Enrollment Strategy and Data Science. Like Joretta, my introduction to higher ed was actually as an academic, or I guess first as a student and then as an academic, and then took a detour into enrollment management. My own professional career has been split between enrollment research and predictive analytics and financial aid, and spent some time as a chief financial aid officer at a university. And for the past 6 years, I have been part of the Carnegie family, first at McGuire Associates, and for the last 3 years at Carnegie, working alongside our very talented enrollment strategy team, providing our recruitment and student search consulting solutions, and also our extremely talented data science team who does all things prediction of student outcomes, inclusive of and with a particular focus on the application decision, the enrollment decision, but also persistence and success outcomes after that. And we've been fortunate over the course of this past 6 months to be working with Joretta and the Credo team as they come into the Carnegie family. And that's, I think, sharpened and supplemented our expertise when it comes to outcomes assessment, and is one of the things that's really brought us here today. So looking forward to the conversation. And with that, I'll hand it back to Trent to run through the agenda.
Awesome. Thanks so much. Again, don't forget, we're going to be taking questions in the Q&A section of the Zoom panel. So our agenda today, as we kind of think through this concept of discovery to distinction, is really, we're going to frame the conversation, talk a little bit about where are we at in this current moment in time. We're going to talk a little bit about the disconnected journey that students often have, really reframing the student experience, and then thinking about and giving you some key takeaways of some things that you could start doing this now in this cycle to really be thinking about this concept of discovery to distinction. So I think that the important part about that is really definition of words, right? So when we think about discovery, obviously this is the moment where a student is discovering your institution and really thinking and deciding about your institution. And then the distinction piece of it is, we love alliterations, but the distinction piece of it for us is really about, we like to view that as it's about graduating, it's about completing a program, it's about getting the whether that is a degree or a degree completion or program completion, and really being prepared to then go and live a life of meaning, taking what they've learned during the course of their time together. So that's what we're going to do today, and we're going to go on and dive right in. And so really for us, we want to recognize the fact that students are more than just this prospective student. They're more than just a high school sophomore, junior, senior, and more than just the student that's going to enter your campus. These are ultimately your future alumni, your future board members. They are leaders in their community. They're change makers. Oftentimes, I often say, we're in the business of recruiting. We're not in the business of recruiting new students, while oftentimes we're evaluated on our efforts to recruit new students. We're really in the business of recruiting future alumni to the institution. And so when we think through that at a really simplistic form, that's really kind of where we want to think through this moment of discovery to distinction. And so we have to really making sure we're investing in the student experience from the very moment that a student is discovering us all the way through that through line, and through that moment of graduation. And really it's about discovery to distinction. And so when we think through this moment of discovery to distinction, I think one of the biggest things that oftentimes we have to do and we have to kind of reflect on is this moment of how do we define a student? What is the student journey when we think about this with lifelong impact? And so I often define kind of what that ideal student is from an admissions standpoint, really by these 5 things, right? They have the moment where they choose to enroll. They have a transformative experience at your institution. They often leave the place better than they found it. They graduate and they complete the program. They then leave the place better than they found it. And then they give back as an alumni. And I don't just mean financially when I say that, although the development people want you to give back financially. But really, this is about representing the alma mater. This is about having the diploma in their office. This is about leveraging the experiences they had while they were a student into their workforce and continuing to be a proud alumni of the institution. So really at the high level moment this is the moment where we want to really define who these students are. Now, recognizing this is a very 1985 version of understanding this moment of it'd be great. Yeah, Trent, that's great. It'd be great to find students that meet all these criteria, but it's really hard. So let's talk a little bit about what's happening in the market and understand what's happening in the world outside of our campuses and how that potentially impacts this through line. Mike?
Thanks, Trent. So as Trent moves forward, I do want to offer a bit of an apology. I'm going to be sharing a few things that I'm confident are seared into the consciousness of many of you, especially those of you that have worked in higher ed, especially in higher ed enrollment, student success over the course of the past 10 or 15 years. I do think that it's worthwhile to define the challenge. And we'll share a couple of difficult and sobering slides and visualizations. And I promise from there, it will all be solutions and roses and rainbows. The first challenge here, of course, is something that we've known about for 10, 15 plus years, that to some extent faded into the background as we, as an industry, confronted the challenges of COVID. It has not been necessarily at the forefront of the discourse around higher ed for the past year, as the political environment has become very fractious with higher ed, but still remains the single most impactful underlying factor in enrollment conversations. And that's the fact that we expect, based on things like anticipated birth rates or birth rates, anticipated immigration inflow, that we are currently at potentially a high watermark in the number of high school graduates. Now, of course, the number of raw high school graduates isn't in and of itself obviously 100% predictive of enrollment success. There are students who are non-traditional students. There are students where they are entering after time in the workforce. It's also true that if you capture a larger proportion of high school graduates who are interested in attending an institution of higher education, you can persist and succeed even in a time of narrowing student pipelines. The challenge is that we are going to see a potentially significant, depending on your location and the dynamics of your state and region, reduction in the number of available students for traditional first-time enrollment direct from high school over the course of the next 10 years. That isn't news to anyone on this webinar, I'm confident. It's also the case that depending on where you are in the United States, this is something that you may have been confronting for 5 to 10 years already, because there are some regions that will actually experience growth over the course of the next 5 to 10 years. There are some regions that are just now topping out and are at a high watermark. And then there are other regions where this has been very much your lived reality for the last 5 to 10 plus years. So the first challenge here, just reminding us that while we have confronted and are confronting other challenges when it comes to enrollment, student success, higher education more generally, the looming background here is still the very the critical challenge of a narrowing student pipeline. Where I think that's really sharpened is in the next visual, which is the extent to which Americans generally feel confident in higher education. Now, if you saw this, the Gallup just released a refreshed version of this last week. And in that, a lot of the news coverage was about the uptick. It was about a slight bounce back from what had been this nadir of confidence in higher education, at least over the period that Gallup has been asking this question in this format for the last 10 years. So I don't want to glide over the fact that there was slight improvement. I also think that's in some ways heartening, given that it has been a very difficult 6 to 9 months for higher education in the political environment. And confidence in higher education, and this is addressed in the Gallup report, which I recommend that you read in more depth and we can share as a resource, is to some extent correlated with political attitudes. And so that's an unfortunate consequence of the current political environment. But it does mean that seeing that slight uptick in the number of respondents who say they have a great deal or quite a lot of confidence is potentially heartening. But the other reason I raise the notion of political attitudes and the impact of the current political environment on confidence in higher ed is that over the 10 years of the steepest decline or the 8 years, from 2015 to 2023, when we saw this sharp drop in the proportion of respondents who were indicating that they had a great deal of confidence, that was in many ways not nearly as fractious a political environment as today. And so as we drill into that, and Gallup does a good job of working through this potential, this drop in confidence is related to a lot of other things. It's related to cost, it's related to value, it's related to student debt, it's related to concerns about borrowing, it's related to changes in the job market and the extent to which a 4-year degree is seen as a prerequisite for, or a bachelor's degree is seen as a prerequisite for certain industries. And so a lot of our current environment is defined by this fractious political discourse, but a lot of the erosion in confidence in higher education has been attributable to some of these broader questions around affordability and value that we're going to revisit in the course of today's presentation. The next slide is, I think, one of my favorite presentations of student success data. And this is not to imply that first-time retention to the following fall semester or the following fall term is the definition of student success. We know that we don't limit student success to first-time full-time students. We don't limit it to persistence into the second year. We don't limit it to undergraduate students, period. But this is, in many cases, the single most often reported and recorded and analyzed stat is this sort of fall to fall, first term to first term of the second year persistence. The National Student Clearinghouse, by virtue of the access to data that they have, and is able to report in a bit more granular way, not just what proportion of students are still at their initial enrollment institution in the fall of the second year, but also which students are enrolled at any institution in the fall of the second year. And I think that's important because it might be that a student departs your institution, but they depart your institution because they find a better fit for a variety of other reasons at another institution. That's not a positive for your institution necessarily, but it's not the same as a student stopping out entirely. But I share this to note that we still have this profound challenge, which is that even with this very limited, very focused stat on these first-time students and their persistence into fall of the second year, almost 1 out of every 3 students is choosing to depart, on average, the institution at which they enrolled and the institution at which they likely spent 12, 18, 24 months, or potentially longer, building a relationship with, building that affinity, making that decision, following through on that recruitment and enrollment. And even though about 8% of those will find a home at another institution, and certainly we hope that that's a fruitful part of their higher education journey, we're still talking about 1 out of every 4, 1 out of every 3 students who are either stopping out completely or transferring or enrolling at a different institution. I mentioned that I'm fortunate at Carnegie to work with the data science team. We do a lot of retention modeling, and we do a lot of student success modeling generally. And as part of that, one of the things that there's obviously a lot of contributing factors to persistence and especially first year retention probability. There's academic, there's socioeconomic, there's behavioral, but the one umbrella sort of general understanding that we've come to bring to this work is that a lot of it is about unfulfilled promises. And a lot of it is about what the student's expectation was during their recruitment and enrollment process, and how that encountered their lived experience, how that encountered the reality of their first term or their first year at their chosen enrollment institution. And so I bring that up as a framework because it's one of the things that contributed to how we've prepared today's content, and this notion of a promise during the recruitment period, a promise during enrollment, and a promise beyond that. But to note these 3, that we are already aware that we are facing challenges when it comes to demographics in higher education. We're already aware that a significant portion of students that enroll are choosing to depart. And we're generally aware that there is this erosion and particularly difficult perceptual environment around higher ed right now. And I think all 3 of those together serve to sort of sharpen the mandate to bring new approaches to student success, to bring new approaches to linking together recruitment and student success. And that's where I'd like to hand it off to Joretta for a bit more.
Thanks, Mike. I'm mindful that we started out today saying, hey, we're going to have some solutions for you. And so far, it's been pretty gloom and doom. And I'm not sure that next couple of slides will do anything but sort of incorporate some of the complexity of that. What I do know is that I just want to pause and remind us that it's, and think to yourself, here I am in the field of higher education. Most of you are leading in higher ed. And I find much of the work that we're doing today at Credo and at Carnegie is reminding leaders we are in this for the right reason. And the transformation of students' lives, it does matter. And the distinctive experience that Trent was speaking of at the beginning, that for the individual human being, for the tree of their family, for what their legacy might be, and certainly for our country. So let's all lean into solution as we identify that. So as we go forward, we think, well, gosh, the climate, the challenges externally seem that much more challenging to us. And I'm going to add, Trent, as we go to that next slide, that the journey itself of the student really elevates the complexity. So I don't know about you, but many who are outside of higher education will say, well, once they do choose your institution, what's the big deal? Why is that so difficult? What's so challenging about getting my sibling, my daughter, my son, my parent through that program? And we've been researching this for decades, not just Credo and not just Carnegie, but our field, our industry. And the framework you see on the screen here really helps us unpack that together and say, okay, we've got the external pressures, but once the student does decide on my institution, what's making it challenging to really meet that promise or those multiple promises? And so, sort of honed down in the literature, here are some dimensions that help explain. And we at Carnegie hope elevate why we must be in a strategic collaboration around designing this journey. We can't say to our recruitment partners, bring them in, and then we can't say to any individual group on campus, make them successful. The industry, the climate, and I am telling you, the student experience. For example, the dimension of identity. It's who is that student and what are their goals? And, often what the literature tells us is they've got imagined promises in their minds. Not only do they have their own goals, but they have family perceptions of what's going to take place and their own perceptions as well. So we know students stay and actually thrive, right? They have that distinctive experience when what they want and imagine will happen is fulfilled. And by the way, not fulfilled in the 10th semester, but fulfilled along the journey. And I think that's part of our challenge. We also know students stay when the network around them says, you ought to stay. It's worth the challenge and the work. In fact, in the research related to first generation students that came out of UCLA even 3-4 decades ago, that all pointed to what are we doing to help the support network around those who are underserved or underprepared to actually create advocates for staying and thriving and engaging, right? How do we navigate that? We see the same thing in adults who are returning. What's that circle like around them? And so the network of support also is critical to their being able to engage. That dimension that Mike has talked about a little bit when it comes to cost and what it means to actually invest, that dimension in the research that we have done about what helps them thrive is it is the cost, and that cost has a flip side of, is it worth it? Is every day worth the value of what I'm investing and what I believe I am investing? The second part of that is, and are you in partnership with me to do this, or am I all by myself? So the work related to why students stay in that dimension itself is, have we built the systems and processes that make the student and the circle around that student think, hey, we're in this together. You're not alone in that process as we go forward. And that's part of building the value proposition with them. We also know students stay. And again, this is not going to be new to anybody that's on this call today. We know the strongest dimension for really transforming a student's life is developing curiosity, having a learning experience, tying that together with what they already know and what they see in the future. And most frequently, that happens through a faculty relationship. So that's that learning dimension. And many times our gen ed curriculum or the way we build a schedule or even who is advising in the first few semesters or first few courses for our adult students or our professional students, all of that has impact on whether I, as a student, think of myself as an imposter or think of myself as really finding my way and seeing that through line. That dimension of belonging and finding community, that is more difficult post-COVID than ever before. The literature just points to how difficult it is to actually engage different generations of students. And then you think about our hybrid classes and our online classes. What are we doing to create that, right? And then leading the way, that dimension around career, I wish that could be shown in this little framework right here as really a motivator through all of these dimensions. Because what's happened to us, even in the 5, 6 years pre-COVID and since COVID as well, is that has become a motivator for us. Really, we're talking about the career pull really belonging in an ecosystem across our students' experience, not as an office or an action, but as a through line. So I offer you, what's so hard about the student success process? Well, it also is embedded in the fact that we're just not built to really collaborate, are we, you all? I call these cylinders of excellence, right? These are not silos. These are really how beautifully and brilliantly we have designed the work in student affairs and in recruitment and in marketing and in financial aid and in the first year experience. We are really good at what we do. And we often are so good and so specialized that the through line of the student experience is not been thought about or really completely integrated. I like to say there is a difference between cooperating between those silos or cylinders of excellence and strategic collaboration, and putting the student at the center of every decision and designing that experience from the time they're interested in us to the time they donate and come back and contribute to their society and to our institution needs to be thought about as a through line between those elements and between all of us. So we've presented to you now going forward that we can see we are sort of really facing external challenges. We are also sometimes not realizing that it's a complex world for the student to have that transformational experience and that we may not be as adaptive as we need to be. So we've been thinking, what are the promises made and how can we ensure those promises get delivered? And what does that look like, particularly starting, Trent, in the recruitment part of the cycle? So let's talk about that a little bit. Trent?
Yeah, thanks, Jorda. It's I think you talk about these people in the student's experience, and I think like we all take a moment to like self-reflect, which is what I did a little bit during your while you're talking, is we can identify those people that like helped get us through that moment. And so when I think about this process of like our own lived experiences, I oftentimes put myself back in the shoes of a high school 17-year-old or 16-year-old discovering institutions that I was looking at, right? What was that moment? What are those moments? And those institutions that really appealed and attracted for me personally were those institutions that really kind of got to know me as an individual, right? It's this moment of this discovery phase from an institutional vantage point where the institution discovers what my needs are, whether that is based on web traffic or whether that's based off of asking me questions or my application or whatever it happens to be. And then it was about connecting me with services, right? Connecting me with those opportunities that I was going to help me understand how I could have a successful time and a successful experience at those institutions. And I think oftentimes as admissions professionals, we kind of we forget to take that step back and we get caught up in the open rates and click-through rates, and all those things are important. But at the same time, the student is at the center of all of our work. And if we keep the student at the center of all of our work in this discovery phase, especially, it's really our job is really about revealing what the student experience is going to be like on campus. And it's how do we tell the story, right? How do we craft the narrative and tell the story of our current students, of our graduates, of what's happening on campus, and do it in a way that personifies the institution, that really reveals in this deliberate, thought-provoking way this moment of this is who we are as an institution. This is what your student experience is going to be like. Oftentimes we say, oh, this is what our brand is. And so I think brand is an absolutely important factor in all of this, but It's really about how are we aligning our brand, how are we aligning our communications during this discovery process with the student's needs. And ultimately, then a student, if we do that effectively, a student ends up having this moment of like, yeah, I want to be at this institution. I want to go to this institution. And that's the very first decision part of it, of the process. And so when we think about this connected student's journey, we really are thinking in this discovery, decision, and distinction, almost this moment of there's a lot of mini cycles that a student will go through. So while overall there is, hey, I'm discovering an institution, I'm making a decision to enroll, I'm going to graduate. If you think about it as these little moments and these little discovery, I make a decision, I'm going to take the next step in terms of a distinction process. And that's really what we need to be thinking about as enrollment professionals and as higher education leaders, is this moment of how are we helping students in each one of these little cycles that ultimately feed into the big cycle. And we really think that it's about, this if we keep the student at the center of all of that work, that's ultimately going to be helpful. So when you think about recruiting the student, again, it's about discovering those needs, it's about revealing the experience, it's about aligning the brand, and then ultimately that student makes a decision, and then they're ultimately enrolling at the institution. Mike.
Thanks, Trent. So as Trent mentioned, the way that we think about tying together enrollment and student success is this loop of discovery, decision, distinction. But even within decision, I think very concretely what this means, and we'll have some additional examples and in a moment, is that enrollment and student success is a repeated series of decision points. We've done this potentially unhelpful thing in higher education, which is focus all of our time and energy and resources and on the decision of enrolling, the decision of where to enroll. And we even call it decision day, even though a typical May 1 decision day is the experience for the minority of students attending institutions of higher education in the US. And so we have focused all of this time and energy and attention on the decision to enroll in a way that naturally incentivizes institutions, naturally incentivizes the consulting partners that work with institutions to also focus all of this time and energy and resources on this decision. And that bleeds away opportunities to treat student success and the success journey as a repeated series of decision points, such that the student is choosing your institution each time they register for the subsequent term. They're choosing your institution each time they complete their financial aid requirements and work through how they're going to meet their expenses for the coming year. They're choosing your institution every time if they're having a residential experience, go home and come back. Each one of those we've treated for a long time as, once you've made the decision to enroll, they're just a cascading series of obvious steps. And the reality is that we know that, well, no, not if on average 1 out of 3 students is leaving just after the first year, never mind after the second or third or fourth year of study without completing a degree. And so refocusing this energy throughout this point, saying that these are repeated series of decision points, not one big moment of inspiration and then a series of cascading steps that happen naturally, but a series of conscious and intentional decisions that have serious, significant financial consequences. They have significant consequences for students' lives and opportunity costs, and what would they be doing if they weren't enrolled. And that means that we need to bring that same attention when it comes to data to those same points. So that means that studying with the same vigor that we currently study application conversion and yield, that studying persistence, and that means first year retention, it means second year retention, it means fall to spring, it means isolating into what are the processes that we've put in place and how are those providing students the feedback that they need to make the decision. And so you've seen some of these and some of these initial experiments be successful. I would cite specifically, Joretta has a particular expertise in this, is integration of the career and professional development journey into the enrollment and student success journey. I would say also efforts by institutions to incorporate expanded financial literacy programs into financial aid counseling on a year-by-year basis is another opportunity to treat this as a repeated series of decision points. And each one of those cases, what you're trying to do is provide the student and their family, if their family is involved in the decision making, with the information they need to confidently say yes over and over and over again with the same energy and vigor that you did in the recruitment journey and in the print campaigns and in the email campaigns and in the on-campus events and in the calling campaigns and in the in-person conversations. Is bringing that same attention, bringing those same resources to this term by term financial aid process, course registration process, student success advising process, career office, career and professional development engagement process, allows you to show students that what they're on is this process of investment. And the more that we think of this as investment in a repeated series of decision points, the more we can get away from what I think is unfortunately currently a typical experience, which is being courted during the recruitment process and then finding, and I'll speak very personally here because I was a former financial aid administrator, it is particularly true in financial aid offices at some institutions, an immediate and very jarring transition to a transactional experience. And we go immediately from here's what the institution can do for you to here are the 10 things you need to do or you will lose your spot at the institution. And that can happen in the space of a week or a month over the course of their enrollment journey. And creating those experiences, building those integrated experiences is a key part of what drives us to distinction. And for that, I'll hand it off to Joretta.
I so appreciate, Mike, that idea of going from sort of courting and inviting to then moving to, and now that you're here, you have to step up. And I think all of us who are on the call today would recognize that that complex experience of the student journey is often blocked by varying stages of the student really being interested in engaging and being equipped to engage. And this is all along the continuum of the age of the student, the returning student, the transfer student, the first time, full-time or part-time kinds of students, who's leaning in. And so that brings me to one of the most important points that we can work on collaboratively in designing the experience, and that is, who are our students? And serving our students well. Many times we'll go to campuses to help this work and to integrate this work. And we find that our campus, both faculty and staff and sort of our culture, are waiting for a different set of students to arrive. And we've got to have a centralized focus on teaching well the students that we have, and knowing how to help our faculty and our staff. You all, this is not just on faculty in the classroom, but it's all of us. How do we serve this student? How do we serve this student's advocacy group around them as well? And then secondly, we need to be better organized. Distinctive kinds of transformational experiences are not haphazard. They're planned. The best vacations, yes, they have those moments that are sort of what happens when you're in a great place and something happens to you. But we want this investment to feel like there's a plan that's driven by data, that is measured, and that is strategic, and that everyone knows what that is. It doesn't mean that everyone has to be a Mike Keene financial aid expert, but it does need to be that our entire campus has an understanding of what that through line is, that we all own the plan, and we know why we do things differently at each stage for that student. And by the time the student moves through those first few weeks with us, they can see there is something that's been built that's linked together. Right? That's that driven by a campus-wide plan. That makes me feel like I am getting value for the investment that I'm experiencing, right? And then speaking of the value, you all, we just can't delay it. We're working with generations and questions about value proposition that we have to respond to more quickly. I don't know about you, but those services that offer me the quickest out of the box and I can actually utilize experience are those that keep me coming back. I want someone who has thought about me as the user. And so many times in our student experiences, that delay of what they've been waiting for takes weeks, months, something like another semester at least for me to have what I thought was going to be a defining experience. I go back to that career ecosystem of I thought I was coming here driven and motivated by exposure to a network and readiness for a career or something I'm interested in. And I don't want that delayed. I want to see that in my accepted student day experience, right? I want to know that's going to happen in my orientation. I need to see that built earlier into my experience. So that's that embedding and that's that design. And then finally, we need to know the systems that are being built. This includes the kind of technology and the data and the user friendliness and the policies that we've established. Those need to be built and continuously improved at the systemic level to meet the needs. The next time the student logs in, it's better than it was before because we've been paying attention to what students as a whole really need. And then we can deliver individually, right? So many campuses say what's unique about me is that we have relationship with students. And I want to say, I want to have a system that's built so you can have a relationship with a student with the right reasons, right? So let's get both system focused and then the ability to adapt to student needs. Those together can make the individual who's coming and choosing us really believe they have planned for me. Right? They're prepared. This is integrated for me. They are keeping the student at the center of all decision making. And finally, that through line is, and we are going to keep resourcing and learning about what it takes to help students learn and launch, right? We are not the experts in this moment. It's changing too rapidly. Degrees themselves are out of date. It's the learning to learn that will be consistent for. So how are we preparing ourselves as well? Trent and Mike and I were saying, gosh, if we had to step back into a campus tomorrow and do that work, what might be one of the first one or two things that we would do? And we want to leave those with you today, just as a starter of our conversation. Trent? Trent, you're on mute. There you go.
I know it wouldn't be a Zoom meeting unless someone started talking and on mute. I didn't see my little mute sign. Shameless plug before we get started though is go into the Q&A. If you have questions, the Q&A is part of the Zoom functionality and drop those because we'll be answering those in just a second. So when I think about this moment of discovery, designing for distinction, and thinking about this, I think oftentimes what we do as is we don't take the time as enrollment people to sit back and create systems and processes to focus on the transition. Oftentimes, the transition of a student from, hey, they paid their deposit, they're coming here to campus, they've come to orientation, great. Now they're the rest of camp. Now they're on campus, and I'm turning on to the next class. So I think we have to really think about this moment of many campuses have retention flags designed. We learn and build relationships so deeply and immensely during the recruitment and admissions process, oftentimes with families. Students disclose things to us throughout the process. Maybe, hey, I come from a single family household and, my mom is facing these battles or, whatever that happens to be. Those get disclosed to an admissions person during the process, but I think oftentimes what we lose is this moment of getting that in the hands of the campus community and of the key people that are going to keep an eye on the student in order to make sure that the student is supported throughout their time. And so while we think about this moment of like, oh, you're going to be supported here and you're going to have all these resources here, if we know right the day one when students walking onto campus, they're going to need these resources, we need to build systems and we need to create systems within our CRM system, whether that's Slate or something else. We need to create systems in order to track this information, to track this data. So then when it comes time for move-in day or shortly before move-in day, there's the handoff to whatever your campus structure is as it relates to kind of supporting those students, being very deliberate about, hey, advisor, here's some background information beyond, the student is from this place and graduated with these grades. Oh yeah, and by the way, this is the lived experience that we know about in order to continue building upon that relationship. So that's the first thing that I would really focus on, is building a system within the enrollment and admissions operation that helps focus on the transitioning the student to campus.
As the data person, I think one of the shared experiences many of us have likely had over the course of the last few years, and I'm saying this because I did promise my Carnegie colleagues I would raise this as an example, is the smiley face, sad face as you leave the airport restroom. And I raise this because it's a data scientist dream, because it is rapid point in time collection of feedback data that you can link to all sorts of other things. You can link to high traffic times. You can link to schedules of when the restrooms are serviced. So there's an opportunity to develop and have a sort of running tally of feedback. I'm not suggesting that these be put outside classrooms or financial aid offices or registrar's offices or student psychological services offices. But I do think that there's something about this notion of continuous feedback that is really critical and is under-resourced currently for institutions. And I want to give an example of something that I think is not something that's tremendously expensive. It's not something that requires, a team of 10 data scientists. And that's that when you collect feedback from your students during their admission and enrollment experience, and collect feedback in a similar format during their undergraduate and graduate career, and then compare those. So I mentioned the retention research that we've done. One of the most interesting pieces is when we're able to ask the same students at entry questions about what their expectations are, what motivated their interest in the institution, what were the critical factors to their decision, and then again at the end of the first year, at the end of the second year of study, say, now what has your experience been of those things? And that's where you are very easily able to identify where are the biggest gaps between the recruitment experience, the promises, and the lived experience and the reality. I will offer to you that in many cases we find that campus dining services is identified as the largest gap between expectation and reality. And I will leave that without further exploration. I'm confident that many of you have had these discussions on campus about dining services, but that might be an example made partly in jest, but it's also a very real example to say, well, what is it about the lived experience? What is it about how we communicate about that? Do we, give the impression of a certain experience that we're not able to deliver on? You can't get that without these feedback loops. And so investing the time and the energy into developing a system where you are continuously assessing satisfaction, not with a smiley face and sad face, if that's not realistic, but with opportunities for students to indicate how the lived experience of their educational experience is matching up to what they were promised during the recruitment experience, is a really critical piece of data to identify where you need to invest to improve.
Yeah, I'd pick up on that, Mike, and say one of the ways to really even organize around that, and a question I would raise if I were headed back to campus is, who owns it here, right? And it is one of the questions that seems to just stymie cabinets and boards of trustees and even campuses when we talk to them. And the first answer that we get when we ask that question is, well, everyone owns student success. And we have learned to say everyone has an investment and a reason to want to and an impact. But who at the end of the day is staying awake at night and whose position is related to the strategic relationship and thinking about student success? Who owns it? Who guides it? Who measures it? Who ensures that we're working on that collaboration? So one of the first steps I recommend is getting that clarified. And secondly, clarifying what kind of power does that person have? Does that person have the power to do anything or the resources to do anything? It is extraordinary to me how much we invest in the recruitment of the student and in marketing and branding that student. And then as we think about the strategy that goes through related to the most important part of designing that student experience, that we have not resourced it at the strategic planning level. And so to that end, we really want to make sure clarity and empowerment and resources as well. A couple more I think we have. Trent?
So one of the things that I think about is this moment of oftentimes as enrollment people, we think about we got to get people to move-in day, or we got to get people to census, and we focus our efforts on that. And because that's oftentimes, to Retta's point about whose job it is, oftentimes most enrollment leaders are evaluated on a deposit number or on a move-in day number or on a census number. But I challenge us to really think about this moment of, anti-communication communication, anti-melt communication that continues beyond the student moving into campus, reminding them and reassuring them that they've made the right choice, reminding them and reassuring them and connecting with them with campus resources. Oftentimes, I had a mentor one time tell me that 80% of your job in admissions is marketing externally, and 20% of it is actually doing some internal marketing. And this is that moment of how do we focus some energy and effort on marketing and reassuring the student through continuation of anti-melt campaigns. I want to see, if I were back on campus right now, I would actually go and create an anti-melt campaign that ran all the way through probably census day of the second semester when a student's there, as part of that constant reminder of their decision and of connecting the promises that we've made during the admissions process with the promises that we're delivering as a student on campus. Mike.
One of the things that I mentioned earlier is that I think institutions have done increasingly well during the recruitment experience, but which is still only in its early stages when it comes to continuing students and student success, is this notion of moving from transaction to investment. So if you look at the ways that many institutions speak to students and parents and families about value and the financial aid award and net cost as investment, as delivering value, as setting the student up for lifetime success, as this momentous decision that the institution is a partner in, and then make that clunky transition to now you better not get a 2.99 more than once consecutive semester, or else you'll lose this scholarship and likely need to stop out of the institution. That clunky transition from transformational to transactional. The one of the things that this idea of financial aid as financial literacy, and if for those of my financial aid colleagues and my enrollment colleagues who have aid experience in the audience, all of you are thinking right now, it doesn't mean anything if they don't come to the events. And I would acknowledge that. I would acknowledge that the RSVPs are not great when these events, especially when they are voluntary. But I do think that developing a relevant and continuous program of financial literacy over the course of at least the undergraduate experience that reinforces that even though you had all of this support, all of this information, all of this counseling available when you were making this decision, that each subsequent time that you accept a federal direct loan for the coming academic year, each time, or the first time when you complete your entrance requirements, when you're understanding these as financial instruments, that there's an opportunity to renew that each subsequent year and say, we want to reiterate that this is an investment you are making and this is the anticipated payoff, but this is also something that is an important partnership between you and the institution to provide this transformational experience and transformational product, for lack of a better way of saying it, and for you to invest in it and continue to invest in it and make the most of that experience. And that's where I think that the more that we can treat this as an investment, the more we get to this, the opportunity to confidently say yes over and over again, each term, each quarter, each semester, each year, is providing students and their family members the data they need to be able to confidently make that decision. And when we reframe that from transactional, do this or else, to investment and experience, we do better financial aid work and we get better outcomes.
And that leads us right to that idea of how do we get what's most important to the student, to their support network, lived out earlier. And many of us could talk about some strategies, but I'd just say if I were going back to a campus right now, I would ask about those first 18 months or first 8 weeks if I were in an online course with adult students, and say, the reason I chose to come, how is that lived out in every part of my first experience? How can I see that so that when I ask myself, is this helping me be prepared for my long-term goal? And can I share with my family that it is, or with my support work and my network that it is? That compels me to see it is an investment as we go forward. So much that we could talk about there. But I think, Trent, we want to get to some Q&A at this stage of the game. I'll let you guys.
We do. We have some great questions that have come in, and I'm going to pull those up here. As well as if you have questions, we'd love for you to go on and drop those into the Q&A section of the Zoom functionality. So we're going to start. Looks like Michelle had a question that says, how do we get over the idea that how do we get over the idea that helping students see the connection with their career goals as almost an affront to a liberal arts education? So this is a really, really interesting perspective. Joretta, do you wanna take a swing at this one? I'm curious. I have a potential thought, but would love to get your thoughts on it.
So one of the things I've just learned in the many decades I'm doing this, right? I came from the humanities and then the fine and performing arts as well, is in some ways we who are delivering the product, right? We're the ones who separate those out. It's the student who has them integrated in their thinking. And if we can begin to simply have conversations about that early on, about what are your gifts and skills and why would you choose this profession? What's drawn you into this? That's number one, is just the conversation. And I often will tell faculty and staff, if you could just share the why for you, about why you chose what you're doing and just what brought you excitement about what you're doing and the career that it led to, and why you're in what you're in, that helps students see a journey for many people as well. So sometimes we've learned and heard from students, just talk about it with me, right? Don't wait for this to come up after I accrue something, but instead, can we have conversation about it early on? We don't have to explain the liberal arts. We can just talk about, what are you going to do? What you're calling, right?
Yeah, and I mean, I think that the other piece is that we have to, again, put ourselves back in that student's perspective. And I think oftentimes we describe ourselves, especially thinking in this moment, I put myself in a liberal arts institution, this moment of like, people don't understand the history of the liberal arts and the fact that it's actually the liberal arts and sciences, and it goes back to ancient Greece. And, this moment of it was about teaching people how to be valuable members of society. And I think there's that moment right there where you say that, and this is what I would always say is, to be valuable members of society, I think we all want to be valuable members of society. Now let's talk about how this manifests itself in 2025 with relating to this is how we approach this. And I think it's about helping define that story for someone and help them truly understand why your institution leverages and utilizes a liberal arts approach and how that actually does help in terms of career outcomes, in terms of this moment of those connecting with those career goals. So that's the advice that I would give and that I have given to students. So I'm going to go on to the next question, and Mike, I'd be interested to know your perspective on this one. The comment was, "I love the idea of a consistent survey and multiple points in the journey. Do you have advice on how to collect these surveys to get significant response rates for the cohort?"
So I've got a few thoughts here. The first is, when we talk about collecting and trying to get a baseline of sort of feedback from the recruitment process, there I would say that speaking to students during that transition from the admission and enrollment, or if you have a commitment deposit, the admission and deposit into orientation and registration, that is a moment where students are two things that are very valuable. One is most aware of what likely contributed to their decision, because you do want some level of recency. We don't want to be asking about something that happened 4 years ago and then expect that we're going to get in-depth, valuable feedback. And the other thing, frankly, is that they're a little bit more compliant because of this notion of this transactional experience, that now they're in this mode where, like, what is everything that I need to do to make sure that I solidify my place at this institution, get my, get housing if I'm living on campus, get my classes, meet my advisor. And so that's a great response rate opportunity right there. Once they are enrolled, that fades over time and sometimes pretty quickly. And I think there it is about two things. One is being where the students are. So the reason that the happy face, smiley face is so successful is because it's right there and it's easy. The advantage of having, and it's the same reason why when you use an app periodically, you'll get a pop-up, and we're all annoyed by the pop-ups. But all of it is an effort to be where the consumer is or be where the customer is, so that you can measure and get a sense of their feedback. In this case, I think it's about environments where the students are taking action. If it's at course registration time, if there's an opportunity following that to have something that says, would you provide your feedback? If it's any sort of web-based portal environment that is inviting students to take action repeatedly, is also a place where you can include an invitation. I will also say that you can also continue to do the traditional invite students to share their feedback by email, by text, in larger settings, because when we're doing these repeated cross-sectional measurements, we don't need 1,000 or 2,000 students every time. It is valuable to have 100 students at a time once a month over the course of 48 months, even if they aren't the same 100 students. That will still reveal things. It will still identify patterns that are important for matching up the students' experiences during the recruitment process with their lived experience on your campus. So I don't think we should worry about, oh, you can only get a 15% response rate with this admitted student survey. That's great. That's, a couple hundred more responses than you had before. We're only getting, 50 to 100 students a month participating in this ongoing survey. That's fine. You're collecting it over the course of years, and that data is really rich and valuable. So I acknowledge the real concerns about response rates. They're low and getting lower. But I still think that there's value, even outside of the incentivize and pizza parties, and those are still successful in many settings. But the opportunity to just regularly collect feedback consistently and put those feedback instruments where students are is the way to maximize response rate.
Awesome. Thanks, Mike. And thank you all for joining us today. We appreciate it. We hopefully you got some good value out of this. These are conversations that we're having around Carnegie. These are conversations and a good insight into kind of what we're thinking about as we really think about, promises made and promises delivered, and that through line from discovery to distinction. We'd love for you to check us out on our blog, on our website, learn more about what we're doing. We'd love to engage in conversations. If you're having these same conversations on your campus and are looking for a partner in order to help you navigate these conversations, we'd love to be part of those conversations with you. So thank you again so much for joining us. We appreciate it. We'll get this emailed out to you all in the next little bit, and have a great rest of the summer, and best wishes onward and upward.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks all.